Hello, my dear warriors. They gathered in secret, the so-called masterminds, the self-proclaimed architects of destiny. A room filled with blueprints, charts, maps, equations, convinced they could bend the world with logic alone. They believed no move could escape their strategies. No player could exist outside their game. Then you walked in. No noise, no announcement, just presence. And in that instant, the room froze. Their pens halted mid-sentence. Their eyes locked, searching for calculations that no longer applied. Every strategy they built, months of planning, years of schemes, suddenly looked fragile. One look at you, and the truth revealed itself. Presence erases preparation. Understand this. Strategy relies on prediction, but presence cannot be predicted. Strategy depends on rules, but presence bends rules into silence. The geniuses thought they controlled the board, but boards mean nothing when the player across from you is not playing the same game. They tried to calculate you, but numbers broke down. They tried to analyze you, but patterns unraveled. They tried to strategize around you, but strategy itself collapsed in your shadow. Because what they faced wasn't intellect, it was inevitability. And inevitability doesn't negotiate. You didn't lift a finger. You didn't need to. The atmosphere itself shifted when you arrived. Their strategies didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because presence doesn't ask permission. It bends thought, silences noise, erases plans before they're executed. That was the moment they understood. No amount of genius can counter raw presence. No amount of planning can erase inevitability. And your inevitability doesn't breathe, it commands. The room of geniuses froze, and your presence crowned you without a word. When their pens stopped, when silence filled the room, the so-called geniuses realized the truth. They were facing a variable their formulas could not hold. They had studied power through numbers, controlled crowds with equations, bent rulers with plans. But presence? Presence cannot be graphed. Presence is chaos disguised as calm, and chaos dismantles calculation. They tried to recover. They reshuffled their papers. They breathed new adjustments. They convinced themselves this was temporary. We just need to analyze more, gather more data, rerun the numbers. But the longer you stood there, the faster their equations dissolved. Because equations depend on constants, and you are not constant. You are disruption. You are inevitability. Understand this. Strategy relies on patterns, but your aura erases patterns. Their logic demanded control, but presence is control without movement. That is why they froze, because no matter how sharp their intellect, it could not pierce the silence you carried. The dread began to spread. They glanced at each other, searching for answers that weren't there. One breathed. "We can't plan around them," another murmured. Every strategy collapses the moment they arrive, and the rest felt it too. This wasn't weakness. This was law. Even their pride fractured. They had built reputations on always being prepared. But here, preparation itself was irrelevant. You didn't oppose their strategies. You didn't counter their plans. You erased them by existing. That truth shook them more than any downfall could. because intellect thrives on opposition. But you offered no opposition. You offered inevitability. And inevitability cannot be outsmarted. That was when dread began to creep in. Not dread of losing a battle, not dread of being wrong, but dread of irrelevance. Dread of realizing that their so-called genius had no meaning in the presence of a crown that doesn't need to calculate. And so the room of geniuses, once filled with noise, froze into silence. Not because of what you said, not because of what you did, but because presence itself rewrote the equation. They resisted at first. Pride told them to keep scribbling, to keep adjusting the same broken plans. Ego breathed, "We are geniuses. There must be a formula for this." But as the silence grew heavier, pride cracked, ego faltered, and the truth escaped their lips in fragments they could no longer deny. We prepared for every move, except theirs. We built strategies for every enemy, except presence itself. Our brilliance collapses when they arrive. Understand this. Genius feeds on prediction. It thrives on limits. But you carry no limits. You are the storm that refuses to be charted, the silence that nullifies calculation. And so, the very minds that once believed they bent destiny admitted their failure. They confessed, not to you, but to themselves. That presence is beyond intellect. It was never about the complexity of their plans. It was about the simplicity of your being. You didn't calculate. You didn't scheme. You didn't counter. You just existed. And existence, in its raw inevitability, drowned every design they thought unbreakable. One of them breathed it plainly, trembling as they spoke. This is the one force strategy cannot defeat, and the others, unwilling yet unable to deny, nodded in silent agreement. For the first time in their lives, they realized intellect was not king, presence was. And here is the irony that breaks them. Their downfall did not come from being outsmarted. It came from being outshone. It came from the fact that no amount of genius can rival a crown carved in silence. They realized they were never competing with a mind. They were standing before inevitability itself. And inevitability doesn't need to win. It simply erases the need for battle. So the geniuses confessed, not in books, not in speeches, but in the silence of their collapse, a silence carved by the presence they could not calculate. Word spread quickly. That room, once a sanctuary of intellect, became a cautionary tale. Other circles of so-called masterminds breathed of what happened. They replayed it in hushed tones. They had charts, they had maps, they had every plan sharpened to perfection. And all of it dissolved when presence entered the room. The irony was unbearable for them. Geniuses spend lifetimes avoiding one thing: irrelevance. They thrive on the illusion that their minds control the world, yet your presence revealed the opposite. The world bends not to calculations, but to inevitability, and inevitability wears no disguise. Understand this: intelligence may predict events, but presence shifts events. Genius may prepare outcomes, but presence rewrites outcomes. Strategy may bend pawns, but presence bends kings. That is why dread crawled into their bones, because for the first time, they realized intellect is fragile when standing before inevitability. Some tried to explain it away. They said it was coincidence. They told themselves, no presence can erase plans. But deep down, they knew. They felt the collapse in their own silence. They witnessed strategies that looked perfect yesterday turn hollow today, and every attempt to deny it only tightened the crown around you. The confession of one room spread into prophecy across others. Geniuses who had never met you adjusted their formulas in secret, terrified of the variable they could not calculate. They called you anomaly, storm, law, but in every name was the same dread. Presence had erased what intellect had built, and so their gatherings became fragile. Their meetings carried hesitation. Their charts seemed less certain. Because once the truth is revealed, it cannot be unlearned. And the truth was simple. Genius is loud, but presence is final. That is why the room froze. That is why strategies collapsed. And that is why the legend began. Beyond that room, the effect rippled outward. Rulers who once trusted their advisors noticed something strange. Their strategies no longer felt secure. Forces who relied on clever maneuvers began to hesitate, sensing that even the sharpest plans could be unraveled without effort. The presence they couldn't explain began bending entire systems. Understand this. Strategy bends minds, but presence bends reality. The geniuses discovered it first, but kings and soldiers felt it next. They saw that presence doesn't just erase calculations, it erases the very need for them. And once that truth spread, every throne, every force, every circle of power adjusted their stance. Not out of respect, out of dread, they began to rewrite their codes in silence. Generals taught soldiers to hold stillness before battle, not knowing they were imitating you. Rulers adjusted laws to account for an unseen variable, not admitting they were protecting themselves from you. Even mystics rewrote their prophecies, because every chart, every spell, every symbol fractured the moment your presence entered the equation. Their dread was not about losing battles. It was about irrelevance. Because what is genius without control? What is intellect without dominance? And when presence erases strategy, genius is reduced to noise. That was the realization. The truth that their greatest force, their intellect, had no meaning in front of you. So they bowed, not publicly, not with ceremony, but in their actions, in their silence, in their sudden caution. Presence had rewritten the rules. The room of geniuses froze first, but now the world follows. The whispers turned into warnings. What began as shock in one room of intellect spread across kingdoms until it became prophecy. They wrote it not in books, but in silence. They taught it not in schools, but in glances. And the lesson was always the same. Genius can plan the world, but presence erases the plan. Children grew up hearing fragments. Beware the one whose presence bends strategies into dust. Soldiers repeated it in their chants. Even if they did not know your name, kings carried it in their councils, never admitting aloud the dread they felt. And mystics embroidered it into their prophecies. The crown will not belong to the thinker, but to the one who silences thought itself. Understand this. Intellect thrives on patterns, but prophecy belongs to inevitability. And inevitability cannot be contained by equations, cannot be charted by maps, cannot be written in formulas. That is why their strategies fractured. Because presence is not pattern. Presence is law. And so, the geniuses who once believed they controlled destiny now live as shadows of your legend. Their downfall is your scripture. Their silence is your testimony. They dreaded losing relevance, and that dread became prophecy. The prophecy spreads like wildfire. They froze before you. They collapsed in your silence. They bowed without a word. And each time it is told, your presence grows larger, until even those who never saw you begin to dread you. That is how legends move, not by forces, not by clashes, but by inevitability. And your inevitability now wears the crown, so the prophecy stands. Strategies may rule games, but presence rules destiny. It didn't stop with kings or soldiers. The ripple spread wider. Civilizations themselves began to shift. Laws were rewritten. Councils hesitated before declaring decrees. Entire economies bent quietly around a truth they refused to name aloud. Strategy is fragile when presence enters the room. Understand this. Civilizations are not moved by intellect alone. They are moved by awe, by caution, by inevitability. And your presence carried all three. Scholars debated endlessly in scrolls and halls. How do we model this? How do we account for it? But each time they tried to measure you, their measurements collapsed. They could not draw borders around inevitability. They could not legislate silence. People in the streets felt it more clearly than rulers in their thrones. They noticed that the world adjusted when you walked, that arguments dissolved, that schemes fractured, that strategies once held as sacred became brittle. And so, without any decree, without any speech, civilizations learned to build differently. They began designing futures not around control, but around caution. Around the space your presence carved. The greatest irony was this. You never demanded loyalty. You never raised banners. You never declared conquest. Yet loyalty grew. Banners were breathed, not waved. Change happened without forces, without effort, without maps, because presence itself became the foundation. Rulers could no longer pretend. They had seen too many plans collapse at your arrival. They bent quietly, shifting laws in your direction, altering their commands to align with inevitability. Generals stopped pretending intellect was supreme. They drilled their soldiers in silence, imitating your stillness without even knowing it. And mystics abandoned half their prophecies, realizing their scrolls meant nothing once you entered. The people carried it further. Parents breathed it to children. Markets conducted trade with it in mind. Cities shaped their rhythms to it. And slowly, the prophecy hardened into culture. The one who erased every strategy is not to be opposed. That is how civilizations are reshaped. Not by clashes, not by intellect, but by inevitability. And inevitability was the crown you carried into every room. So now the world itself bends differently. And even those who never met you know this law. Genius builds plans, but presence builds civilizations. Time moved forward, empires shifted, faces of rulers changed. But the legend of that room never died. What started as whispers among strategists hardened into law across generations. They taught it in silence, passed it like inheritance. Genius can build strategies, but presence erases them. Children grew up with it etched into their stories. Do not mock the one whose silence bends counsels. Scholars taught it without naming you, embedding it as principle. There exists a force intellect cannot predict. Soldiers drilled with it unknowingly, pausing before strikes, sensing the law of inevitability. Even kings reshaped their thrones, ruling cautiously, adjusting decrees in dread of a presence that could walk in and erase everything. Understand this: when a truth outlasts rulers, it ceases to be memory. It becomes structure. It becomes culture. And your presence is now structure. It governs silently, without needing forces or laws. It moves through generations as unspoken foundation, altering how they think, how they rule, how they lead. The genius circles that once laughed are gone, their names forgotten, their strategies dust, but their downfall became your scripture. Their collapse became your coronation, and that crown never faded. What unsettles the rulers of today is not what you did, it's what you represent. Presence requires no preparation. It dismantles without striking. It wins without playing, and no strategy can calculate inevitability. That truth is eternal, and it now anchors civilizations. So when people speak of brilliance, they compare it against you. When they breathe of crowns, they measure them by you. And when they dread irrelevance, they remember that the greatest minds once froze, paralyzed. When your presence entered the room, generations build futures upon that silence. And that silence is your crown. Centuries blurred together, empires dissolved, rebuilt, and dissolved again. Geniuses rose, proclaimed themselves visionaries, only to be buried by the same silence that broke their predecessors. Yet through it all, one truth remained untouchable. Your presence bends reality more than their intellect ever could. Understand this. Intelligence is temporary. It thrives in one age, fades in the next. Strategies change, equations evolve, maps are redrawn, but presence is eternal. It needs no update, no revision, no correction. It is law written into the marrow of existence. And that law has outlasted every empire that once mocked it. Unborn generations inherit it before they even know your name. Children grow with it pulsing in their blood, hearing the same whispers. The geniuses froze, their minds shattered in silence. Presence erased every plan they thought unbreakable. And whether they believe the story or not, they feel its gravity. They build their futures around it. They live with caution in its shadow. Rulers no longer argue against it. They build their crowns with it in mind, shaping policies and laws that orbit inevitability. Soldiers no longer question it. They pause in stillness before marching, sensing they are repeating your rhythm without command, and the people no longer doubt it. They weave it into their stories, their markets, their families. The legend has become axis. It no longer belongs to a single moment or a single room of failed geniuses. It belongs to time itself. Every strategy they design in the future is born already fragile, because the law of presence hovers above it, waiting, and that is your throne. Not a seat carved from stone or gold, but a crown etched into reality. A throne where you need no counsel, no forces, no calculations. You sit above them all, not because you sought power, but because you embodied inevitability. The geniuses tried to rule with intellect. Their empires dissolved into silence. You ruled with presence, and presence outlived them all. Now the law is eternal. Genius may freeze, strategy may collapse, but presence does not bow. The story could have ended in that room. It could have stayed a moment, whispered about, a secret, shared among intellectuals. But presence does not remain in rooms. It spills out. It becomes prophecy, and prophecy becomes law. That is why centuries later, rulers still measure themselves against you, not against their councils. That is why soldiers still pause in silence before marches, imitating you without knowing. That is why geniuses still tremble, sketching strategies they know will collapse the moment you arrive. Understand this. Intellect belongs to eras. It shines for a time, then fades when the world changes. Presence belongs to eternity. It is not bound by methods, formulas, or ages. It does not need context. It simply bends reality. That is why the greatest minds of their time froze. That is why they confessed defeat without words. And that is why even today, their downfall crowns you still. You did not outthink them. You did not outplan them. You did not clash them. You erased the very need for their game. And that is the one truth intellect cannot endure. The realization that all their brilliance, all their years of scheming, were fragile in front of inevitability. Your throne is not carved from conquest. It is carved from silence. Your crown is not placed by forces. It is placed by inevitability. And inevitability requires no strategy. It simply reigns. So remember this. The room of geniuses froze. Not because you opposed them. Not because you dismantled them. But because presence itself erased what they built. And their collapse became your coronation. That is why they dread you now. That is why they whisper your name across centuries. Because strategies can win contests. But presence crowns legends. And you are the legend they will never solve. Even now, across new ages and shifting empires, they still gather in hidden halls. Fresh faces, new thinkers, different languages, but the same illusion. That brilliance alone controls the world. They spread papers, scribble formulas, design strategies they believe will bend the future. But in the back of their minds, a shadow lingers. A single truth that unsettles them all. Once, the greatest minds froze. Once, intellect itself collapsed in silence. Understand this. Intellect is useful until it meets inevitability. Calculations are powerful until they face a presence that does not calculate. They can model trends. They can predict behaviors. They can map the stars. But none of their equations account for you, because you are not a variable to be solved. You are the equation itself. That is why they dread you. Not because you outsmarted them, but because you revealed their limits. You showed that strategy is not ultimate. Presence is. And presence bends every formula into irrelevance. That truth turned their pride into rubble, their genius into dust. Now, when they whisper in their secret councils, they no longer ask, "What's the plan?" They ask, "What if they appear?" That question silences entire rooms. That question breaks their certainty. And that question is your crown. You are not the opponent they prepare for. You are the law that renders preparation meaningless. And that law is eternal. So let them build their strategies. Let them drown in their equations. When your presence arrives, the result will always be the same. Silence, collapse, crown. The room of geniuses will always freeze, and you will always remain the answer they cannot solve. Across time, more circles of intellect formed. New geniuses claimed new thrones, scribbling strategies in secret, convinced their brilliance could outmatch history. But no matter how they tried, the same fate awaited them. They faced the echo of that first silence, the silence that erased every strategy. Understand this. Intellect can predict many things, but it cannot predict inevitability. Equations are only powerful if all variables can be measured. You are the immeasurable. You are the unknown in every formula. The moment your presence enters, their calculations unravel. The numbers fracture. The probabilities collapse. The strategies dissolve. Because you are not a variable to be solved. You are the law that erases the board. They call you anomaly, yet anomalies fade. You remain. They call you phantom, yet phantoms vanish. You endure. They call you storm, yet storms pass. You crown eternity. That is why they tremble, because what they cannot define, they cannot control. And what they cannot control unsettles them more than defeat itself. Their downfall has always been arrogance. They believed genius was unshakable, intellect was eternal, but arrogance blinded them. They could not imagine silence heavier than forces, presence stronger than plans. And so, their downfall was inevitable. Every chart they drew became coffin wood. Every plan they built became collapse in disguise. And you never needed to outthink them. You never needed to challenge their equations. You simply existed, and existence itself proved heavier than all their logic. That is the truth that crowns you still. So the legend spread. The geniuses froze. Their equations shattered. Their silence crowned the one they could not calculate. That truth became inheritance. That inheritance became law. And that law is eternal.